And now from Washington, the Inside Scoop. All the news the government does not want you to hear. Now, here's your host on the Inside Scoop, Mark Levine.
Good evening, America. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. When George Bush was running for president, he had a domestic policy that in most respects was a typical standard Republican policy. Tax cuts to benefit the wealthy, to make it burden a little harder on the middle class, but to make it easier for people who were making a lot of money to do better. We had Social Security, he wanted to privatize, lots of welfare benefits for corporations. These are all pretty much standard Republican agenda. But one way he stood out is something that wasn't standard Republican agenda, at least it wasn't spoken of that way at the time, and that was on the No Child Left Behind Act. Bush on education proposed something different. People considered it even more moderate. The idea that we would test kids, and if schools didn't test kids well, maybe those schools shouldn't have funds. That's sort of the basic idea, but the devil's always in the details. And the question tonight is whether we are indeed leaving children behind. My guest today is Kenneth Bernstein. He is a 12-year public school teacher. He's the co-author of a George Washington University study that critiqued the No Child Left Behind proposal when it was first proposed. And he's a founder of the Educator Roundtable, which calls for repeal of the No Child Left Behind Act. Ken Bernstein, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
Mark.
Let me start with the whole concept of No Child Left Behind. George Bush wasn't the first to come up with those words, was he?
Different phrasing of the words, leave no child behind, Marion Wright Edelman, and the Children's Defense Fund a number of years before.
Now, the Children's Defense Fund was an organization, Hillary Clinton, I think, played a role in that organization to protect children, is that right?
That's correct, and I believe she was I know she was on the board, I believe she was chief counsel.
And it was to protect them from things like violence or legal mishaps and things like that.
It's not my area of expertise, I just have a vague memory.
Right, it's just interesting to me that he sort of used that phrase,
Sure.
leave no child behind, to become the No Child Left Behind Act. Now, when this was proposed originally, it had a decent amount of Democratic support.
Not in completely its original format. Two key players from the Democratic side were the then ranking members, and then one became chairman with the switch of the control of the Senate, George Miller in the House and Teddy Kennedy in the Senate, both of whom saw this as a possible means of getting more federal funds for schools in poor areas. In addition, George Miller, to his credit, had seen that school systems in California often hid how badly they were working with their minority children, Hispanic and African American, and he saw this as a way to hold them to account for all children.
And what's interesting about this, of course, is that when George Bush talks about the bipartisan legislation that he's done, this is one of the few examples. Virtually every other piece of legislation, whether it's Medicare or the war or any other such thing, it's been Republicans either forcing it through on a very partisan manner. But this is something he likes to say, hey, this is one thing we Democrats, Republicans could agree on. Now, I know it hasn't quite gone the way perhaps it's planned. Let's go through what the act does and what it's intended to do, and perhaps where it's not meeting what's intended to do. What exactly does No Child Left Behind do?
Well, there are a number of features to No Child Left Behind. And what this requires, the key portion that most people focus on, is that all students in grades 3 through 8 must be tested every year in reading and in mathematics, and once in high school. And schools must show that they are making adequate yearly progress, disaggregated, I'll explain that term in a moment, among all groups, towards 100% proficiency by the year 2014.
Okay, 100% proficiency. What does that mean?
Whatever level the state sets on the test as it's using as being proficient, every single student in every single group by the year 2014 is supposed to be meeting that proficiency level.
Now, obviously, that's a goal. I mean, one of those proficiency levels could be to read at a certain level or do math at a certain level. But, you know, there's 300 million Americans. There's, I don't know, 50 million school-age children or so in the United States. Surely not every one of those 50 million is expected to meet that standard.
Under the law, yes, they are.
What if they have special needs, or they're autistic, or they came here speaking another language?
Under the current plan, if you came under another language for 1 year, you're allowed to be tested using different instruments, and then you're supposed to be tested the main way. This is a big issue in Virginia right now because the Fairfax County schools don't want to do that, and they're in a fight with the U.S. Department of Education. As far as special education, as far as everything else, the counter argument that's given is that if you don't give them the same tests, then you will not give them the same opportunity to learn.
Okay, now, so it's 100% in 2014. Is it, what's it, 50%? This started in 2001, I guess.
The bill was passed in 2001, signed into law 2002, which means, I believe, the first year of the effectiveness of the act was 2002, 2003.
And what were the levels set at that time?
They're not set. That is, the first year you have tests. And then based on whatever the tests are, let's just hypothetically say that, all right, I am at 40% now and I have 12 years to get to 100%. I've got 60% that I need to make up. That means I have to increase by 5% per year.
Okay, but so we take a test and there's some standard. And these standards are set by the various states in the District of Columbia?
Each state could use its own tests. There are no national tests, nor are there any. There are theoretically some criteria, but it gets to be pretty complicated, and the act has been adjusted a little over time as to how it is. But theoretically, each state could set its own test.
Okay, so the state sets a test, and then you find out how many kids pass the test or get a certain grade level on that test, and then it's determined what the school's current proficiency level is based on that test. Am I getting it right so far?
In general, yes, except, and this is what the act requires that was different, you don't get one score for the school. The school does not make adequate yearly progress unless each group in each grade makes adequate yearly progress.
Okay, so in other words, in grades 3 through 8, if a school makes progress for all groups in grades 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8, but one group in grade 7 doesn't make the progress, that school hasn't met its standard?
That is correct.
And what happens to a school that doesn't meet its standard? Does it lose funding?
Not directly. There are a series of steps that go through, and the implementation of this has changed a little bit over time. Part of what will wind up happening is there are options at a certain point that a student is allowed to transfer out of their neighborhood school to a school that is passing. But I want to come back to that point.
Well, what percentage of schools are passing? If you have a level where every single kid in every single grade needs to pass, I would suspect that the great majority of schools across this nation are failing.
Well, it's not true that the great majority are failing. In some places, in inner cities, most of the schools were found not to make adequate yearly progress because they did not improve enough from whatever their baseline was, or they'd have one or more groups that did not meet it. The issue becomes, however, that for a lot of states, even if there was a school for you to transfer to, they had to have room for you to transfer. Now, the federal government has since said that that doesn't matter. They have to create the room for you to transfer.
Well, let's go back.
That's only one of the options.
The purpose of this act is to measure how well schools are doing and to, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, reward the schools that are doing well and punish the schools that are doing badly. Is that at least the purpose of the act?
I know of nobody who can argue that there are rewards or benefits to schools that go well. There's just an absence of punishment.
So there are no rewards. If a school is doing perfectly well, every student passes at 100% levels, they're giving great AP scores, this is the school that should be the national model, they get no more money?
And there's an argument that they shouldn't. They don't need it.
Okay.
The argument should
So
be,
all this does is punish the poor-performing schools. It doesn't reward the well-performing schools.
The intent is not to punish. The intent, at least by the advocates, was to identify so that resources could be directed and so that you could do the proper focus on those students needing help. However, even the way we measure is a little bit of nonsense because you are not comparing, let's say this year's fourth graders, 40% pass their reading. We're not going to look at them and say, gee, they did 50% in fifth grade, therefore they've improved. No, we're looking at this year's fourth graders against next year's fourth graders.
Well, classes are as a teacher, I mean, they must be notoriously different. Sometimes you have a year where the kids happen to be maybe a more brighter or a more devoted bunch, and maybe the next year you don't get so. I mean, that's just the random nature of teaching, right?
And that is one of the problems with the way that we are using testing. There are states which attempt to address this by using some kind of gain measurement or what's called a value-added score. The original education proposal, while it did not mandate it, that was the one case where there was a reward that if schools had value-added test scores, how much a kid had improved under a teacher, and those scores were disclosed to the parents that the school got a benefit. But it was a rather small benefit, and that provision was knocked out.
Let me just understand the basic way that the Act works. The kids take a test one year, okay, the fourth graders, and there's some standard set by the state.
Correct.
And they have to read at a certain level. Like, I mean, I've taken SAT scores, so tests, so I remember those, and you have to, by the way, they're multiple choice, or are they essay, or they can be anything they want?
This is not defined by the Act. Most of the states, because of the cost, is purely multiple choice.
So A, B, C, D. So even a reading and writing, which is something that's notoriously difficult to test, A, B, C, D, generally that's the way it's done.
Again, just to give us an example, the state of Connecticut had a lawsuit with the Department of Education. They tested every other year with much more qualified tests, including elements of writing and so on. They asked that they be allowed to continue that. They were told you must test every year. They said that's too expensive for the money we have. They were told to use cheaper tests.
So here, that's very interesting. So the state of Connecticut wanted to do better tests, more extensive tests,
Which
tests
they
that
already
measure
had in
writing,
place.
but they cost more and they couldn't afford it because they didn't get enough funding under No Child Left Behind.
A funding issue, and I want to come back because we haven't talked about all
We're
the
going to talk
sanctions.
about funding.
Okay, let's touch on funding very quickly. The amount of funding that is authorized, okay, by the Act has never been met by the Bush administration. And each year, the percentage of what was authorized that they have committed to the original functions as a percentage has gone down. And you actually have some information on that on your computer.
Actually, I do. Let's show that, folks, just to give an idea of the difference in education funding.
That's the total budget.
If you look at this chart that Ken Bernstein has provided, what it shows is that in 97, 98, 99, 2000, and 2001, which would actually be under the Clinton administration,
The 2001 fiscal year budget would have been submitted to take place October 1st, 2000.
So, okay, so that's still under the Clinton administration. Under the Clinton administration, you see educational funding went up 15%, 12%, 12%, 1 year 6%, and 1 year 18%. Then you have the Bush administration. The first year from this chart, education funding went up 18%, the same as the Clinton administration, then down to 6, which would be the lowest level in the Clinton administration, then down to 4, then down to 1. And last year, Bush asked for a decrease in education funding?
The actual amount of the request was a decrease for last fiscal year and also for the forthcoming budget.
And in fact, if you look at fiscal year 2007, you see it's a decrease of actually 4%. Why is Bush asking for less money in education? I thought the whole purpose of this bill and the reason why Ted Kennedy and others supported it was to bring more funding into education.
Okay, what you're looking at is gross education department funding. And by the way, these are not my figures. This is from the Democrats on the House side having put this together. There are many programs beyond No Child Left Behind, and many of those have either been capped or cut or eliminated. And what Bush will claim is that he's putting more money into what he wants as No Child Left Behind and has eliminated quite a few other programs as well, so that the overall spending has gone down. I want to go back, if I can, just...
We're going to take a break.
Sure.
But when we come back, what I want to do is I want to explore the Democrats that supported this, why they supported it, and whether they continue to support it. Have they been disappointed? And what real statistics do we have in terms of whether this is really helping children or not? And folks, if you have an experience with No Child Left Behind, whether it's a teacher or a parent or even a student, and you want to comment on it or ask a question of our expert here, Ken Bernstein, please feel free to call in. The toll-free number is 888-488-MARK, 888-488-6275. We'll be right back after this.
History has demonstrated that violence only begets greater violence, and injustice only begets greater injustice. This is not the tradition of our great nation. This is not how we want the United States to be known around the world. We have another tradition that we think ought to prevail. One that is more just and more powerful. There is a better way. If we truly want peace and security, then we must work hard for justice. If you're concerned that we've become a nation whose national policies are grounded in beliefs that are centered on a line embedded in BS, then don't miss Escape from Orwellia Nation, a talk show in which concerned regular citizens like you and me, not self-serving media spinmeisters, wade through the barrage of newspeak and doublethink that pollutes public discourse today. Big brother, big business, big media, and the big national parties who collude to keep we the people afraid and in the dark would prefer that you not watch. Show them who's in charge. Tune in to Escape from Orwellia Nation right here on Channel 10.
From Washington, back to the Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. Is the No Child Left Behind Act leaving children behind? This is the one aspect of George Bush's domestic agenda that at least originally was supported by Democrats, but it's got a lot of critiques now, and not just by my guest, Ken Bernstein, 12-year public school teacher, the co-author of a George Washington University study that critiqued the original proposal, but even by state legislators and even Republican state legislators across the country. Again, what the act does, correct me if I'm wrong, is it tests the kids each year, and if the children don't make demonstrable improvement, not the same children as you've pointed out, but if this next year's fourth grade class doesn't do better than this year's fourth grade class, then that school is punished either with reducing federal funds or by allowing children to transfer from that school.
The reducing of federal funds is indirect. What it is that some of the federal funds would be used to provide what are called supplemental education services, tutoring, support programs outside of the regular school day to help those children who are not successful. But that still takes money that would otherwise go to the school for its core educational process.
So it doesn't provide new money to tutor these children. What it does is it removes money from the school that's already struggling. And in fact, if they're struggling more, it would remove more money, right? I mean, if the children are less proficient, it would remove even more money from that school.
Well, the act has been modified a couple times back and forth on that, and I'm not, I can talk about it at the impact at the school level, although my school is not, as a high school, is not subject to it as much. But the answer is, in general, yes, that's correct, but there also have been additional funds that have been put in as time has gone on, and there are funds proposed to try to account for the needs of high-impact poverty schools.
Okay. Now, it's been criticized across the country. I know even in Utah, red rib Republican state, Virginia, I hear Republican state legislators criticizing this act by George Bush. What is their critique?
Well, some see it as a first step towards the federal takeover of education. And there is a strong state rights tendency in both Utah and Virginia that would oppose that. Some see it as a move that eventually there will be a request or a demand for national tests, where we've been down this path before and it's been rejected. But some people who are proponents of the act are already proposing that what we need is national tests, because they're finding that states, to avoid the sanctions, are playing games with their own tests and their own scoring.
What kind of games can you do to avoid sanctions?
Set low proficiency levels.
So if you set the bar really low, hey, my kids know the ABCs? Guess what? The 8th graders do know the ABCs. You don't lose funding.
Potentially, yes.
And what's interesting to me is because you could have 51 state standards, there would actually be, I would think, an incentive to race to the bottom, right? Because if Alabama's standard is lower than Idaho's standard, then Alabama children won't be seen as minimally proficient as Idaho's children.
Some opponents of the bill have argued that that's already happening. The evidence on that is not completely clear.
Okay. Now, to the extent, it was very interesting what you point out, that still schools cannot get rewards. Maybe if we look at the funding that's going down, you can only be punished, you can't be rewarded. What happens to a school that is frequently not meeting standards? Maybe it's a school in, as you say, a high poverty area, or a school where there are a lot of children from Latino families, perhaps whose first language isn't English, and that school simply doesn't have the same level as a child that grows up in Beverly Hills and has parents that can teach them apart from the school and so forth. Does that school continually lose funding?
Potentially it could. Potentially it could also, if you get far enough down, and some states have these provisions under their own tests, that state school could be dissolved, or all the members of the faculty of the school could be what's called reconstituted. For example, this is separate of No Child Left Behind, but we have graduation tests in Maryland, and Annapolis High School, the superintendent in Anne Arundel County has basically reconstituted that school. He's requiring all of the staff members to reapply for their jobs because he is not satisfied with what the pass rates have been on the graduation tests.
Now separate for me what is, I guess, good education policy from not so good education policy. I can understand people saying that if you have a school that for whatever reason principals or teachers just aren't doing the job and these kids should be learning, they should be doing better, and this school fails, and now maybe you could say, well, this school's in a high poverty area or so forth, but how could we, apart from No Child Left Behind, legitimately, if you will, punish the schools that are not doing a good job and reward the schools that are doing a good job?
I want to just start with a metaphor. The beatings are going to continue until the morale improves. Now, the whole approach of No Child Left Behind is punitive. Most human beings respond better to something that is not punitive.
Or at least carrots as well as sticks, not
Yes.
only sticks.
Now, to carry it a step further, we are making these measurements solely on the basis of a single instrument or multiple instruments for the two subjects.
Math and English.
Math and English, which are not themselves necessarily a measure of what the student has learned, because all we're doing is measuring what they know on one particular day. For all you know, since you are not tracking the students, that student may have gone in the 4th grade, if he's brand new to the school, from reading at a 1st grade level to reading at a high 3rd grade level. He is still not proficient on a 4th grade level, but that school has done its job, yet he will show up statistically as one who has not. Now, there is an argument to be made if you go back to the original federal involvement with education, which is Title I, that there were school districts that for a variety of reasons had insufficient economic base to be able to properly support education. One thing that if you really want to have meaningful education policy in this country, we will have to totally re-examine how we fund public education.
We do it through property taxes.
We do it through property taxes, and
which means that rich areas can fund schools very well and poor areas can't.
And it gets to be even more dangerous on this, because if I'm in a high poverty area, I am desperate for jobs for my people. So a corporation will say, I'll come in and I'll build a thing there, but you have to rebate my property taxes for 5 years. So you get the new construction, you don't get the additional taxes, and you're still paying for additional services as well.
One of the things I've always found very interesting is that one of the things that Republicans or conservatives like to argue is that you shouldn't be helping people. People should rise or fall as their talents may lead them, and of course the way to do that is through education. But we don't have equal opportunity in America, where we have already wealthy areas. Mm-hmm. They can fund their schools to a very large extent, or we have already poor areas that are already suffering through lack of money. Now, it would seem to me, as you point out, the role of the federal government could be to equalize that process.
Some states have...
I mean, Texas, I know there was a famous case where the Dallas kids were getting 4 times what the El Paso kids were getting, and they forced it to equalize it. My question for you is, does No Child Left Behind undo that process?
I don't think No Child Left Behind is even really cognizant of that process one way or the other.
But in punishing poorer performing schools, aren't they more likely to occur in poverty-stricken areas?
The intent of people who supported it, like George Miller, and while I disagree with Congressman Miller on a couple of points, and he is more than a little irritated that the Bush administration did not honor the commitments they made to him and Senator Kennedy. He believed that it was important because in many cases minority children were in school systems run by white middle-class people who ignored their needs. And because of the requirement of the disaggregation of scores and tracking what was happening, and that is the one good part of this.
So George Miller wanted tests and tracking tests. What he didn't want is for punitive measures to be taken on the basis of those tests.
I think he agreed with the punitive measures because he believed that the situation was so, this is where I would have disagreed with him, that the situation was so dire that we had to do something radically different. I would argue that in many cases we could solve a large amount of the funding problems by the federal government meeting another one of the commitments it's never met, which is special education, which tends to be much higher in high poverty areas, perhaps because of more lead-based paint.
Let's talk about Senator Kennedy. Ted Kennedy is sometimes called the Lion of Liberalism. This is a person who, whether it be universal health care or public education, Social Security, welfare, this is someone who prides himself on looking out for the poor, looking out for disadvantaged people, for leaving no children behind. And yet, he signed on to this bill from the outset, and George Bush has often mentioned, hey, Ted Kennedy signed on to this bill. Why did he sign on to it originally, and do you think he regrets his decision?
I don't know that he regrets his decision. I know that he is committed to making it work. And I know that Congressman Miller is committed to making it work.
Why did he sign on originally? What did he think he was getting?
I think he was getting more federal aid for schools that did not have sufficient funds to turn themselves around.
So he thought he was getting more federal funds. He thought a lot more money was going into education.
I think that would probably be a major part of his justification. He was willing to make some compromises on other issues because of that.
One of the things that those of us who've worked in Congress know is that it's a two-stage process to get any funding. It's a very strange thing, but it's been our way for hundreds of years. You have to appropriate, you have to authorize the money and then appropriate the money. You have to say the money can be spent, and then you have to actually spend the money. And one of the things No Child Left Behind has done has authorized a tremendous amount of funds, but not appropriated those funds.
You have a chart there that's further down that will show this. Keep going.
Isn't this it?
Well, you can do that, yeah.
Let's show this one right here. This says the authorized level and the appropriated level in billions of dollars. We see, first of all, fiscal year 02, $26 billion authorized, only $22 billion appropriated. And as you look across the years, authorization skyrockets, 26, 29, 32, 34, 36, 39. Authorization, of course, is money that could be spent if we wanted to. In essence, it's a meaningless number because if you look at actual appropriations, they are way, way under authorizations. You can see there's even a $15 billion gap. When I worked in the House, I used to hear Ted Kennedy would send his missives around, and the thing he would most complain about was this gap you're talking about. That George Bush swore to me that we would give more money to education. That's why I signed on, but he hasn't fulfilled his portion.
And part of where he wants to spend money is on things that have been consistently defeated. He has another proposal in there for vouchers, even though his last proposal for vouchers was voted down 99-0 by the Senate. But then he can claim that he made proposals. Let me go back.
Before we do, we have to take a break. The toll-free number is 888-488-MARK, 888-488-6275. What's your view on No Child Left Behind? Do you think that children in poor-performing schools, that those schools should be punished by losing funds, or does that end up leaving more children behind? 888-488-MARK. We'll be right back after this.
This is Mommy's bed. Me and Jenny were jumping on it. Mommy's gun fell on the floor. I was a cowboy. Bang, 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 bang. I said, Jenny, wake up, it's just pretend. But she wouldn't wake up. If you give me a fish.
If you give someone a fish,
you feed them for a day.
Teach someone to fish.
You feed them for a lifetime.
Give me a fish, and you'll feed me for a day. Teach me to fish, and you'll feed me for a lifetime.
Through Volunteers of America, you can help change lives in your community.
Oh, hey, mister, you studied algebra in school and got a better job than I could. You take the last cup.
Oh, no, mister. Stuck in an entry-level job because you only learned basic math. I don't have a boss riding my butt like you do, so you take it so you can get back to your desk.
You know, I probably should, but maybe Miss AP Calculus with the $200 haircut in the big office upstairs would like a cup.
Oh, no, mister, what was your name again? Never mind, it doesn't matter. I'm too busy doing important things to care. I just came down for some sweet and start.
You know, if my limited math abilities weren't keeping me from getting a better job, I'd quit this afternoon.
I don't blame you. But thank goodness you're stuck here because we really need someone to make the coffee.
Turn it up, baby.
From Washington, back to the Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. We're discussing the No Child Left Behind Act. Is it working or is it leaving children behind? If you want to call in, the toll-free number is 888-488-MARK. You can also comment on the blog, as so many of you like to do. Just go to radioinsidescoop.com and post your comments there, and we'll be reading some of those on the air. Mike from Centerville, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
I think we're looking at the wrong picture. We're spending a third to half the money on trying to bring up the bottom 10% of the students who, like you said, are learning disabled or otherwise challenged or even economically challenged. We're not turning out the engineers and the scientists. Less than 5% of our college graduates, I know you're talking primary school and high school, our college graduates are not coming out in sufficient numbers to defend this country. As a person who works for the Pentagon, we don't have enough engineers. You look at the rate of engineers, math and science coming out of Europe, it's between 15 and 20% if you include computer science and some of the softer sciences. If you look at China, it's nearly 50%.
Mike, thank you for your call. He's right in the sense that European schools, Asian schools do seem to be turning out more of engineers and so forth than American schools. Do you agree with Mike's analysis, and do you think No Child Left Behind had a role in that?
No Child Left Behind has no role in that, and it's also a distorted picture, and there have been a couple of people who have taken this apart. It's not my area of expertise. Yes, China is, at this point, turning out many more engineers and technicians than we are turning out. For one thing, they don't have them, and their economy is ramping up, and they have a population many times our size. But for another thing is that corporations are able to import people on H-1B visas, pay them significantly less than they would pay American. There's really no motivation for a lot of Americans to go into these fields.
In other words, it's all about the economy. In other words, capitalism, there are economic reasons.
Yes.
I mean, I just know, for example, that back in the 40s, it was interesting that the average teacher, I noticed, made about the average wage of people all across America. Today, teachers make less than 40% of the average wages. The statistics I saw, I mean, I'm a lawyer. Maybe I shouldn't be a lawyer. Maybe I should be a teacher. But our society, wrongly in my view, gives a lot more money to lawyers than it does to teachers. I know you yourself, in fact, turned down a high-paying job.
It's a little different. I was a fairly high-paid person in computers. And when I quit that to go become a teacher, after 8 months with no income and began teaching, I was making less than half of what I'd been making, and I'd been working for local government for less money than I could have made in the private sector.
So society has decided, for whatever reason, maybe I shouldn't say society, political leaders have decided that teachers today are worth less than half what teachers were 60 years ago, that children's education today, public education, isn't worth it. It just isn't worth what it was in the 40s and 50s. Then we valued education. Today, we value it less than half that.
I'm not going to go into those statistics. What I will say is that we lose roughly 50% of new teachers in the first 5 years. There are a variety of reasons. One is we don't do a very good job of bringing teachers in and supporting them. We kind of turn them loose and leave them to crash and burn, and being your first year of teaching can be overwhelming. I had the advantage that I was much older when I came in, and I had experience, life experience that a 22, 23-year-old does not have. But the second thing is where the money does come in a lot of districts, you want to have a family. You can't afford to do it if you're both school teachers.
Now, the teachers' unions, obviously, the NEA, the AFT, are working to provide higher wages for teachers. To what extent does No Child Left Behind affect teachers' wages? I know it's intended to punish schools that are poor performing. Does that end up punishing administrators, teachers, children? What's the actual result of this legislation, I guess, for all three groups, educators, principals, administrators, teachers, and children?
I'm not sure you can tie it directly in terms of anything for compensation. While there are school systems that reward teachers based on test scores.
Merit pay, they call it.
Well, there's a question of whether it's merit pay or not, because I will tell you right now, I taught for Princeton Review for 3 years, tutored for them for 1, and tutored for another company for a year. If you know the structure of a test and you want to spend time drilling kids for tests, you can raise test scores, but it does not necessarily mean that they're learning.
You teach to the test.
Not necessarily teach to the test. You teach how to take the test.
Well, listen, I know that there are kids that take Stanley Kaplan review courses for their SATs. That doesn't mean, I mean, maybe sometimes they're learning 100 lists of words and short-term memory, but a lot of it is sort of learning, well, you should go ahead and fill in the oval if you're not sure because it's this one or that one. That's test-taking skills that have very little application in ordinary life.
Well, except for the fact that you could make the argument, I'm going to be cynical,
that you have to take tests throughout your life.
That what we're now doing is turning all of life into test-taking for everything. But whether that means we've learned anything or not. Let's talk about an impact on students.
Yes, how exactly, the No Child Left Behind Act, how would you say it's affected students nationwide? It's been in effect for 5 years now. What are we seeing? It
is very much narrowing what students are learning. I'm going to use myself as an example. I teach social studies. In the 2002-2003 academic year, I taught 9th grade. All the rest of my career, since I've been teaching 10th grade. I can see the results of No Child Left Behind because we are having kids coming out of elementary and to some degree middle schools where they are not getting the social studies instruction they had before because it's not tested under No Child Left Behind.
They only teach math and writing, math and English.
Math and reading. They will do some social studies in middle school because like in Maryland, for example, we do have tests that include, but we will get kids transferring from D.C. schools
okay, well, that's, I guess, a state issue because Maryland is testing social studies, you're saying? Maybe not enough in your view. Not enough. Okay, but that would depend on the states. Some states are only teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Particularly at the elementary school level, okay, where there usually are not state tests other than the No Child Left Behind. You're also seeing elimination of things like recess.
I was going to say, what about things like science? I mean, you know, one of the things I fear is that we have too many kids who actually believe that creation science is a legitimate form of scientific inquiry.
Let's go into science because No Child Left Behind, as proposed, said in theory, and this would be part of this reauthorization, that we would start including tests in science in the 2007-2008 academic year. So at least in theory we'd be testing science, but then the question is what are you testing and what does it necessarily mean as far as the tests themselves? It is rather clear it narrows the curriculum. It is rather clear that it puts pressures on superintendents, who put pressures on principals, who put pressures on everybody else. We have cases as tests have become more high stakes, and let's be clear about something. No Child Left Behind does not necessarily mean high stakes for the child. But if you put high enough stakes on the adult, the child is going to feel the pressure. And some states are taking the tests that they use for high stakes purposes for the children. We have done this in Maryland. Our 10th grade tests are the high school graduation tests in English and math. And we're using those for both purposes, which is itself a problem because you cannot, test makers, true test makers will tell you, psychometricians, that you cannot draw valid inferences from a test designed for one purpose for another purpose. Either you're measuring what the child knows or you're measuring what the school has done.
Plus there's so much more to learning than, I mean, these tests are what, 1 day of tests? I mean, when I went to school, we would learn a subject and we'd take a quiz on it, then we'd learn another subject, take a quiz on it, then we'd have a test at the end of the year about all we've learned, whether it's history or science or math, things build on it. I don't think you can test, I would hope you can't test, everything I learned in an entire year in 1 day.
Again, there's approaches to that, and some of them are instructionally valid and some of them may be problematic. In the district in which I teach, for all those tests, courses for which there are state tests, we are required to give quarterly benchmarks, which gives us an ability to see whether the kids have learned before we get to the end of the year what they need to know. The problem with a lot of tests is they do not serve the purpose. One of the purposes of tests, besides measuring what the kid knows, should be giving feedback to both the kid and to the teacher.
You got to know if the kid can write. You have to know.
Let's go back to this point. The tests that we're using now, both for No Child Left Behind and other purposes, do not give timely feedback to the teacher. It does not do very much good to come back to a teacher and say, ha ha ha, your fourth graders weren't sufficient, because I no longer have an ability to teach those fourth graders, and by the time you give me the scores, I've already done my plans for the next year.
And those scores, are they all end-of-year tests?
Most states are doing their No Child Left Behind testing at the end of the year.
And by then, as you've pointed out, all they can do is focus on the next year's class. Those kids are in the next grade. One of the things I want to focus on, though, is the politics of this. Because what's interesting to me is that a program which was designed, at least according to Senator Ted Kennedy, was designed to bring more funds into the school, is actually taking funds away. We've seen the statistics about funds going away. And as you've pointed out, schools are rarely, if ever, rewarded. They are generally only punished. So by 2014, if we have a 100% proficiency standard, in other words, every single child in every single school has to reach this level, it would be impossible for our schools to reach it.
It would be impossible for most schools. There will always be schools. Let's be very serious.
There's some schools that are
Thomas Jefferson is going to reach it. H.B. Woodlawn in Arlington, where the kids self-select because they want to be in that environment, are going to reach it. But they're going to be
they're
fewer.
magnet schools, obviously,
across the country. They're going to be few and far between.
So what that means is that at the end of the day, public school funding by necessity has to decrease with No Child Left Behind.
I don't think anybody really has thought out the end result of 2014. I think it was considered far enough off, like a lot of stuff with the Bush tax cuts. We'll worry about it later. It's the kind of thing that we use this as a stick to try to move, and we'll come back and revisit it. Since the bill is up for reauthorization this year, there is some revisiting. I do know to
So this year, it can be reauthorized, it can be repealed, it can go away.
All kinds of things could happen. The guessing among people who follow education policy, when a group of them were polled, is they did not think it was going to get all the way through reauthorization. They thought it would be frozen with where it is right now, both in funding
What
and
are those levels? 60%, 70%? It depends on the school.
No, but I mean, in other words, they wouldn't make major modifications in terms of where it is. There's a group of about 100 organizations, which happens to include both of the teachers' union, which are arguing that if it is not fully funded at the authorized level, that the punitive measures should not kick in. That tends to be a political strategy. I don't support that political strategy because even if it were fully funded, I do not believe it can accomplish its goal.
Well, one of the things, again, whenever you deal with a critique,
sure,
it's often much easier to criticize an existing program than to come up with an alternative.
I criticized it before it was existing.
And yes, you did. But the question is, if we did not have No Child Left Behind, there would still be schools that are performing and underperforming. And to some extent, that's normal. We have kids, as we pointed out, from poverty-stricken or other language cultures. And to some extent, schools just are not as good as other schools. Some schools do a better job than other schools. What do you think, as a teacher, as an educator, what should be done to make our schools better across the country in a way that doesn't do the kind of problems we've seen with No Child Left Behind?
In this, I would probably be very much of a radical, and I don't think you have enough time left in this hour.
Give me the short answer if you can.
I would totally redesign the way that we do education, and in another hat that I wear, actually with several hats that I wear, because I do a number of things about education policy, I am working with a group of people where we're trying to rethink all of education. For example, why is it that we have to start with the assumption that every 10th grader is supposed to be at the same place in every subject? Human beings are not that way. Why can we not? Special education requires every child to have an individual education plan to meet the individual needs of that child. Why does a child have to be learning disabled to have that recognition of individual needs?
So in other words, we could have a child perhaps that's at a 12th grade level in English, a 10th grade level in math, because that kid happens to be very good at English. Another kid is very good at science, and that kid could be at college level science while perhaps only being at a 10th level English course.
And we should be able to accomplish that if we are truly going to leave no child behind.
Very interesting. We got to take another break. When we come back, though, I want to address what's going on right here in Washington, D.C. This is a city that many criticize as spending more money per student than almost any school district in the country, and yet with some of the worst results, and I want your views on that. Folks, if you want to call in, the toll-free number is 888-488-MARK, 888-488-6275. We welcome your calls. We welcome your comments on the blog at radioinsidescoop.com. We'll be right back after this.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
My name is David Bell. I am a resident of Virginia's 11th Congressional District, and I ask Representative Tom Davis to initiate or support investigations into violations of the law by President Bush and his administration.
Tom Davis. My name is Jean Reynolds, and I'm one of your constituents. I want you to join immediately with other members of Congress to begin an investigation of the criminal acts that George Bush has committed.
I'm Nick Spangler of Ashland, Virginia, and I would like our troops to come home and Bush to get out of office.
My name is Nancy Maynard. I live in the 11th Congressional District, and this message is for Tom Davis. I'm asking you to please investigate for impeachment.
My name is Bruce Smith. I live in the 11th Congressional District in Woodbridge, Virginia. I want Congressman Davis to support the investigation of President Bush and Vice President Cheney and those that foisted this war on us.
Hello, Congressman Davis. I'm Carrie Plonson from the 11th Congressional District, and I'd like you to take immediate action to investigate George Bush and his offenses in leading this country into a war that's unwarranted and there is no solution for.
We have to impeach. I am just appalled that we would not, quote, waste our time with impeachment. The message to the world has to be that Bush and Cheney are guilty of international war crimes about which we can't do anything. We can do a lot about the crimes committed within the U.S. Constitution.
From Washington, back to the Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. When the American people are polled, one of the few programs to which they consistently argue we need more funding is education. You can't find other programs that have that level of support. Many even support things like state lotteries and gambling that they wouldn't otherwise support if the money goes to education. But then there's a bill, the federal No Child Left Behind Act, the great brainchild of George Bush, that punishes schools by taking away money from education, doesn't really reward them. My guest is a strong opponent of that. He was an opponent of it when it first was a proposal. He continues to be an opponent of it. He's a 12-year teacher in the public schools. His name is Ken Bernstein. Ken, one of the things that Republicans, when I have them on this show, say is, okay, Mark, you want more funding for education. Liberals want more funding for education. Washington, D.C. gives more funding for education per student than so many other school districts, and yet has some of the nation's most failing schools. How would you respond to that critique?
The funding issue needs to be broken out. And I want to start with something that is general, which happens to hit inner city schools more, which is a chart that I have provided for you on special education funding. And then I'll explain it, and then I'll apply it to D.C.
Okay, let's go to the chart. We have Bush breaks IDEA full funding promise.
IDEA is Special Education, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Okay, so we see that the full funding would give $21 billion and $23 billion and $25 billion, and actually the money's going down this year to less than 40%? So 60% of it's not being funded, only 10 out of 25?
Okay, let me explain briefly because that is a compressed picture. When the bill was passed in the 1970s, the federal commitment was for the average additional cost for special education, which is often twice that for educating a normal student, because this was a mandate, it's a civil right under federal law, that the federal government would pick up 40% of that additional funding.
But we're not
paying
it.
The $25 billion that you see would be at the 40% level.
Okay, so the federal government is required under the law.
It's supposed to, under the law, pick up 40% of the additional cost.
For special education.
It has never picked up 20%. As high as it's ever been is 19%, and Bush's proposal for next year is 17%.
So the idea is that children that need special education, whether because of autism or poverty, one of the things you mentioned was actually lead-based paint, that if kids live in homes that are made before a certain day, they can actually, that paint can get in the water, or they can eat it off the walls and be brain damaged.
Correct.
And that's more likely to happen in poverty-stricken homes.
Correct.
Those kids cost more to teach.
Correct.
And D.C. has more of those kids than a school in suburban Virginia or Maryland, and therefore they don't have the funding, they have to pay more.
And it's worse in D.C. for a separate reason. Please understand something. Whether or not the federal government provides its share of money, the school system must spend that money. And if you have no additional money, that means that money comes out of education from regular children because you do not have a choice. It is a matter of legal right for that special ed child.
So a parent of a special ed child could insist that that child get educated even at the cost of educating other children.
And it goes carry it a step further. If the school system cannot provide within its public schools the appropriate public school environment that meets the needs of that child, then it must pay for a private placement.
Which is very expensive.
In the District of Columbia, including transportation, it can run as high as $70,000 per student.
Wow.
If you back special ed out of the District of Columbia budget and look at the rest of the instruction, they basically spend about the same amount as do districts like Montgomery and Fairfax.
So now that's very interesting. So actually, if you back out special education, the district doesn't spend more than other schools, and that would explain the statistics. I'm going to remember that next time I'm debating to someone here on the air. One of the things that you mentioned is that when schools are poor performing, as the No Child Left Behind Act defines it, that they can lose funds, but apparently they can also allow children to transfer. And one of the things you mentioned was very interesting to me is that if the 4th grade is not performing at the proficiency level, that a 7th grader who is performing at the proficiency level can leave the school?
My understanding, clearly a 4th grader could, and let's even carry it a step further. Let's say the 4th grade narrowly fails to meet adequate yearly progress, but your 4th grader had 100% on the test.
My 4th grader succeeded.
But you are most likely, because you're the active parent and you're going to be concerned, you will take that child out of that school and take them to another school.
So because another kid in my class failed, I can take this kid and move him to another school.
And that will then lower the score for the school for the following year, plus remove the role model of the student who knows how to work and who can serve as a role model for the kids who don't come from the academic background.
Very interesting. Now, of course, we talked about how the children suffer, how the schools suffer. Does anyone profit from No Child Left Behind? I mean, who profits? I mean, it seems like everyone's hurting here.
Okay, under No Child
How about
Left,
the testing agencies?
Well,
they
clearly
must
the
profit.
testing companies are making a huge amount of money, and it is possibly worth mentioning that one major testing company, Harcourt Educational Measurement, is based in San Antonio, Texas, and right after No Child was Left Behind was passed, in one of the major education journals, they published an ad for 10 psychometricians. Now this raises a problem.
An ad for people who can do these tests.
Can create the test.
So in other words, George Bush's allies are...
I can't say whether they're an ally. I could speak on that on the McGraw Company because of the fact there's a long family relationship, but doesn't really matter. Let me just come back to one other thing on this. At the time No Child Left Behind was passed, there were not enough trained test makers in the country to gear up for tests that matched the curricula that the schools were doing to adequately measure, so they were forced to go buy off-the-shelf tests from test companies, which just happened to be very supportive of this bill because they're profiting.
People like McGraw.
People like McGraw, people like Harcourt, people like Pearson Educational Measurement.
Now, one of the things that always bothers me is when you watch people who create bills profit from those same bills. We saw it, for example, in Dick Cheney's energy companies. He brought them all in, they wrote the bills, and they came out with tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money in their pockets. Is there anyone that's involved in this act that has personally profited?
I think you can argue that his portfolio is probably larger. His name is Sandy Kress. He is a lawyer from Texas, nominally a Democrat. He is the principal author of the original draft. He has left the government a number of years ago. Somebody did a study of his clients, and most of his clients are people doing things like providing tutoring services or testing or similar things.
And he wrote this bill to begin with.
He drafted the first draft. Now let's be fair, the bill as it came out has a lot of fingerprints on it. One of the problems with the bill, and you haven't been on a congressional staff know this, to get a bill through, you often have pieces thrown in there to get votes, and the pieces don't necessarily fit together. A number of people argue that it is unfortunate that Kress is able to profit the way that he does, but I want to be very clear on this, he did nothing that was illegal.
Oh, no, there are lots of things that aren't illegal that are still pretty gross, and I think anytime you write a bill and then personally profit from it, that's a problem. Let me go to what you're trying to do. Your organization, you're a founder of the Educator Roundtable.
Correct.
In fact, you have a petition on the web at educatorroundtable.org, a petition calling for the dismantling of the No Child Left Behind Act. You want this thing repealed.
That is correct.
And you and how, I mean, it's not just you, is it?
Well, we have 25,000 signatures on the petition already. We have a core group of, well, I don't know, we probably have several thousand on the mailing list now, but we are actually having a conference in Atlanta at Georgia State University on March 17th, which will include a number of people with national names. Not all of those are public yet, so I can't talk about them.
But you're calling for its dismantling because it's not working, because it's hurting schools, because of all these things we've discussed?
All of the above.
And you want support, I assume, for this process?
That is correct.
So you're calling on people to, what, sign your petition, go to the website, call the member of Congress?
Sign the petition, read the petition, pass it on to other people, talk to their members of Congress about the things that are wrong about the bill, and there are lots of things that are wrong about the bill.
Now, to be fair, you're not asking for the ending of federal funding of education.
We are not. Again, federal funding of education is much broader than No Child Left Behind. The label of No Child Left Behind is on the current incarnation of the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act. We clearly want to see continued funding of Title I, which is the aid that goes to poor schools.
Now, this year, it's going to be reauthorized. I mean, calendar year 2007, when do we expect it to come up?
It is supposed to be reauthorized. Many educational insiders do not think they will authorize it this year because that'll be held over with continuing appropriations.
Does it die then if it doesn't get reauthorized?
They can continue it on the current level and
forever?
Well,
unless a bill is passed and signed by a new president, will No Child Left Behind continue to exist?
No one's quite sure what's going to happen. The betting, if you asked me, given the commitment that both Miller and Kennedy have to a federal government role, something is likely to come out of the Congress. The question is going to be whether they can draft something to come out of the Congress that the president is willing to sign.
I assume anyone listening to this broadcast can go to educatorroundtable.org, find out more information about No Child Left Behind. Is there anything that you would put in its place? You talked about a very interesting strategy, which I think has a lot of meaning. I mean, I just know in my school that you could take higher level courses in English and even remedial courses in math if that's where your talents lay. Is there a specific alternative that this organization is supporting, or basically to go back to where we were in 1999, 2000?
Rather than trying to summarize that, I would say, because it's a work in progress, we start with the petition, which lays out a number of key points. And we're still working on some of the other purposes because we agree on this. We don't necessarily, as a group, agree on the other things. For myself, I would not propose one model. If nothing else, students are so different, we need to have enough different models to meet the needs of all students.
Ken Bernstein, thank you very much for coming here on The Inside Scoop. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about Anna Nicole Smith. There are actually political questions as to why her marriage is supported by groups in the Republican Party. Don't miss that tomorrow on The Inside Scoop.
I'm chasing